Okay, so in order to work with a file, the first thing you have to do is obviously you have to open a file. And opening a file has a few tricks to it. The main thing with opening a file is that when we open a file, we have to know what it is we're doing with the file because we have to tell Python what it is we're doing. Mainly, we want to talk, it has to do with whether we're reading from or writing to a file. Are we putting information into that file or are we getting information out? The other thing is, the other variable here is how it handles what happens if the file doesn't exist already. Like, what does it do? So, this is called the flag, or you can call it the read flag, or you can, in your head, call it whatever you want, as long as you know that the second argument on the open function is telling Python what you intended to do with that file. And if you open it, let's say you open it for reading, and you try and write to it, it's going to generate an error, okay? Because Python is a little strict about that stuff. So what we want to do is when we open a file, we're going to open that file and we're going to store the reference to that file in a variable. So you can call it whatever you want, just use regular variable names. It's good if you know what it means. So obviously you're going to use the naming conventions we've talked about, which are to name it something that makes sense. So if I open it as my file, I'll say my file equals open, and then I'm going to give it the file name as a string. It can be a path on your computer. It can be a relative path. It can be an absolute path that starts with C:2 slashes or whatever your root is for your computer. If none of that makes sense to you, don't worry too much about it, because for this class, most of the time, we're just going to put the file in the same directory as our script. We're going to keep it simple. In that case, I just give it the file name, and this tells me that that's a plain text file. I can open any kind of file with Python. Today, we're going to work with text files because those are the simplest type of file to work with. Later on in the class, we'll open images. We'll do all kinds of different things. Today, just the text file. So I give it a string with a file name in it, and then I give it the flag that says, what am I going to do? So read, pretty obvious, means I'm going to read data from that file. Append means I'm going to add to what's already there. When you see append, I want you to think of like a journal or a diary, right? If you have a diary that you're keeping, and you open it every morning, you do your diary entry, or every night before bed. You open your diary, and you write the date at the top of the page, and you say, dear diary, whatever, and then you close it. And the next day, you start with a new page, you put a new date, and you're just adding to it every day. That's what append does. When you have a diary, you don't go in and you say, well, here's what I wrote yesterday. I'm going to erase that and replace it with what I wrote today. That's not how diary works. So append says I'm going to add to it what's already there. If the file exists, it will add to it. If it doesn't exist, it will create it and then put the first piece of data in it. Write will overwrite what's there. So if you open a file for writing, it is not a diary anymore. It is a blank slate each time. So if you have a bunch of good data saved in a file and you open it for writing, you will delete what's already there and replace it with whatever you write. So the difference between append and write is big, right? So the last one is create. Okay? This is the same as this, with one exception. If you choose create and that file exists already, it will give you an error. The nice thing about this is that it will do the same thing as write. It will start from a blank slate, but it will not overwrite an existing file. So if you want to be safe and you don't want to delete a file that already exists, then you will use create. You can use this with try and except to make sure that if your program encounters a file that already exists and you don't want to overwrite it, that you have a way to redirect your program and do something different. So every time we open a file. We're giving it the file name and the flag. Both are strings, need to be in quotes. Okay? So when we open a file, it is really this simple. And we're just going to say open. It's not file open. It's not anything else. It's just the open function because that's what Python recognizes. And I've got a file here called mydata.txt. I'm going to use this to play around with. You can kind of see what's going on here in this file. I've got some personal information, right? I've got a first name, a last name, an age, and an email address for 3 people. Each one is on their own line. And I've used, these are not ones, these are not L's, they are the pipe character. I told you about this. This is an easy way to store data. Now what I can do is when I go to read this file, I have 1 line per record or 1 line per person. And if I use the split function and I give it the 3 pipe characters, then I can split those into a list that allows me to access those individual data points. So that's sort of my method here. It's very basic, but not uncommon. Okay, so I'm opening mydata.txt for reading. Now, if I open that, and then I just print that, I'm just going to print that variable. So I open that, I put it into a variable, and then I just print it. Okay, I didn't run the right program, which is why I didn't do anything. Okay, so it's not going to print the contents of the file because this is not that, the contents of that file are not in that variable. That variable actually represents that file, the file itself. And you can see the file name, the mode, the encoding, some information about that file is in there. So if I want to do something with the contents of that file, I'm not quite there yet.